Well, I must begin by thanking Ashish, Alexander, and the other members of the collective for inviting me to join you for what will be, for me, a most interesting and stimulating conversation, a luxury the pandemic has denied me for some time. The topic you have chosen is both huge and important. What I propose to do is say just enough to get the conversation going and then leave its course and direction up to you. What I have to say is supplemented by a couple of handouts of an autobiographical nature, both of which relate to our topic. So I trust that by the time I finish my opening remarks, you should have enough to generate a fruitful discussion of what is most important to you. The words Christian historiography can be understood in at least three ways. One is historical writing by Christian authors. The second is somewhat narrower, history written from a distinctly Christian point of view, presumably grounded in a Christian theological understanding of the nature of human history. And the third is historical writing about Christianity, in this case, Christianity in the Indian subcontinent. I will say something about each of these in turn, although I may not give them equal time. I find it difficult to say much about historical studies of the subcontinent written by Christians, largely because they are hard to identify. Only some, not all, of the authors who are Indians have names that clearly identify them as Christians, and it is very difficult to tell which among the foreign authors are Christians because they rarely identify themselves as such. Speaking personally as a Christian who is an historian, trained not in church history but in Indian history, I cannot help but notice how little attention is paid to the role of Christianity or of Christians in Indian history books. You may find references to the missionary threat, to Alexander Duff or C.F. Andrews, both of whom were British missionaries, while the only Indian Christian who gets mentioned much is Pandita Ramabai. This silence is due in part to a general preoccupation with political history in history textbooks, and the tiny Christian minority has not played an overly conspicuous role in Indian political history. However, it is also due to a general ignoring of Dalit, tribal, and women's history, where Christianity's role has been far more significant. Such people, and this includes the entire Northeast, have been ignored as outside what has been called the mainstream of Indian history, even though they have provided much of its backbone. From the outset, I have deliberately decided to write the history of Christianity in such a way that it is an integral part of Indian history, as I have considered that to be an important part of my vocation as a Christian historian. I also happen to think that it tends to make Indian history more inclusive than it has been, incorporating not just Christians, but also those social groups from which the Christian population in India has mostly been drawn. The second understanding of the term Christian historiography begs the question of whether there is a distinctively Christian view of human history, on the basis of which one can write histories of aspects of the Indian past. I devoted 6 pages to this question in the closing chapter of my book, Historiography of Christianity in India, under the heading Theological Assumptions. If you want the long answer to that question, you can find it there. The short answer is this. 2 central Christian affirmations come into play in answer to this question. One is that God is not only sovereign over human history, but God also acts within human history to further God's own short-term and long-term purposes. However, how God does that always has a strong element of mystery about it, which not even the wisdom of hindsight can fully grasp. And that makes human history impossible to figure out as fully as we would like. Christian theology offers neither a grand theory of the workings of human history, a la Marx or Toynbee, nor a meta-narrative for practicing historians to squeeze their research findings into. The other Christian affirmation, best expressed by Herbert Butterfield, is that the Christian doctrine with the most empirical evidence to support it is the doctrine of human sin. This gives to human history a quality of moral ambiguity which the historian needs to take into account. These two affirmations do not dictate what kind of history should be written, or what kind of perspective it should be written from, or even how specific events and changes over time should be interpreted. The working Christian historian is free to pursue his or her own questions about the past and to honor the dictates of history as an academic discipline in seeking and arriving at answers to them. However, these affirmations do impose certain constraints upon the historian who takes them seriously. The sovereignty of God and ourselves as creatures of time and space commits us to the practice of intellectual humility, to giving the history we write an open-ended quality, as well as an openness to the transcendent and mysterious, operative in the workings and unfolding of the histories we write about. There is more to the stories we have to tell than readily meets the eye. So we must leave our readers not with certainties, but with matters to ponder in their hearts. Our Christian view of human sinfulness and the moral ambiguity of human history, and of historians too, by the way, forces us to be very careful in our treatment of the past. And that means, at the very least, following the canons of our discipline as best we can. Moreover, we are to treat our forebears and their contemporaries with respect, following Jesus' commandment to love our neighbors, now deceased, as ourselves, and thus to avoid writing histories of the good guys versus the bad guys, male or female. I recall having visions of going to heaven and interviewing the people I wrote about in the Christian community and change in 19th century North India, asking them, did I get it right? Did I get it right? And this leads me to a more controversial guideline. Both my understanding of human sin in its social dimensions, shaped in good measure by Reinhold Niebuhr, and my experience of writing the histories I have, has convinced me that operating out of a conflict model of human society does far more justice to our Christian understanding of human sin than does operating out of an organic model in which harmony of society's various parts is seen as more fundamental and conflict as a temporary aberration requiring adjustment. I now come to the third way of understanding our topic, historical writing on Christianity in India. My historiography of Christianity in India contains a series of 8 essays, 2 of which, written 3 decades apart, are survey analyses of the development of this field of study. One does the same for Dalit Christian history, and the concluding chapter deals with basic underlying assumptions. The greatest shift in the field occurred in the 1970s when the Church History Association of India, CHI, rejected the mission history approach in favor of a new perspective which focused upon the socio-cultural history of the Christian people of India in relation to other people of India. As the member of the editorial board who drafted it on the basis of board conversations, I had a hand in preparing that new perspective. Moreover, my doctoral thesis on the Christian community and change, which was then in the process of major revision for publication, was an example of the kind of history we sought to prepare. Then, when the other authors made the horrible discovery that the sources on which they were dependent were written from the mission and not the new perspective, I was asked to conduct research methodology workshops at CHI meetings to show how to deal with this crisis of competence. My next major foray into the social history of Christianity in India resulted in what I believe to have been the most influential history I have written. The Dalit Christians, a history, has passed through 3 editions, with 3 printings of the 2nd edition, as well as a Hindi translation of the 2nd and of the 3rd editions. It was the first book about them. Even though a majority of Christians are Dalits, their history has been almost totally ignored in the history of Christianity textbooks, being limited only to their conversion through the mass movements. The personal roots of that history lay in the Punjab, where experiences in interfaith dialogue, when our dialogue partners look down on us because Christianity there has a Dalit image, of discussions with Punjabi Christians about how to handle that situation, and of field research in nearby villages where Sikh Christian relations were shaped more by caste than by religion. At United Theological College, I taught what turned out to be a popular elective course on Christianity and the depressed classes movement, for which I had to do a lot of reading in order to gain an all-India perspective, and prepared 3 research papers. The trigger was a meeting in Chennai at which I shared my research, this was some years later, on Dalit Christians with a largely Dalit Christian audience. At the very end of a long and lively discussion, one of the participants confessed that he did not know what the Dalit Christian heritage was. But that was like a call from God. When I finally completed the manuscript, I realized that the history had important therapeutic value because Dalit Christians had come to believe a lot of lies and half-truths about their ancestors. I suspect that is why the book proved to be so popular and influential. The historian as pastor. Finally, I must mention my social history of Christianity, Northwest India since 1800, which I consider to be my finest piece of historical scholarship. Covering a 200-year period is no easy task, and the book took a long time to write. I used the Chai New Perspective, and it used the Chai New Perspective and was originally intended for the Chai series, but proved to be much too lengthy for that. So Oxford University Press published it, and a few years later, I produced an edition for Chai that was both considerably abbreviated and supplemented with bits of information gathered from subsequent research. Recently, Oxford came out with a paperback edition of the original. From the point of view of Christian historiography, I think you would find the introduction and concluding chapter most useful, but I would not object if you read the entire book.